In particular, we look at capital accumulation within the solo framework. Economic growth is important for a number of reasons. It raises welfare and improves a nation's standard of living. At the end of this podcast, you'll be able to use the solo framework to understand the sources of economic growth. You will understand why a nation's standard of living depends on economic growth. Let's talk a little bit about why growth matters. As you can see, 20% of all infant mortality is concentrated in 20% of the poorest nations, but only 0.4% in 20% of the richest nations. The question is, if we can figure out a way to improve growth, we can potentially reduce infant mortality in poor countries. Now, let's look at this graph, which shows the correlation between income and poverty. What this graph demonstrates is that countries with high income and high growth rates tend to have a low poverty levels. Take South Korea, for example. South Korea's income per capita is almost $20,000. Its poverty levels are almost zero. Madagascar and Kenya tell a contrasting story. That is, they have a low income per capita and high poverty rates. Based on the graph, there is evidence to suggest a negative association between income per capita and poverty across countries. Let's build our solo framework that we're going to use to show why economic growth matters. K is capital stock, and it is allowed to vary. Investment expands the capital stock, and depreciation reduces the capital stock. L is labor, and it is determined by population growth. The consumption function is simpler than what we have covered. The consumption function is 1 minus the savings rate times income. So that's a consumption function that we're going to work with in the solo framework. Let's move on to the production function. This slide shows the aggregate solo production functions, which we simply express in per worker terms. So the new production function is interpreted as output per worker as a function of capital per worker. Now we can graph our production function. This graph shows the relationship between our components of the solar production function. Here we have our horizontal axis capital per worker. On our vertical axis we have output per worker. What the graph shows is that at low capital per worker, output is large because capital is more productive, but at high capital per worker, output is relatively low because capital is less productive. The graph shows a diminishing returns to capital at higher levels of a capital stock. So that's the pictorial representation of our solo production function. Now let's move on to our national income identity equation. This equation shows the familiar income identity equation where Y income is distributed between consumption and investment. All variables are again expressed in per worker term. So that's our national income identity. Let's move on now to our consumption function. Here S is our saving rate, which is a fraction of income that is saved. Now our consumption function again is 1 minus S times income. What this suggests is that consumption is a function of both the saving rate and income. Let's now move on to the other piece of our solo framework, that is saving and investment. Our saving per worker is equal to income minus consumption. Because the economy is closed, saving and investment are the same. When we work through our the simple algebra, what we have is that investment equals saving so the investment expression is our saving rate times our production function. Now we can plot all those components of our solo framework. That is, we can plot our production function, the consumption function, on the investment function on a simple graph. The top schedule FK is our production function, and the bottom schedule SFK is our investment schedule. And again, output is distributed between a consumption and investment. What the graph shows is that capital stock per worker grows. As capital stock per worker grows, production increases and consumption and investment also increase. So we can think about the solo model as the fundamental framework of determining why a country might be poor or why some countries are rich. Now, a country with a relatively high output will definitely be able to generate a higher level of income and therefore a higher growth rate. So we can conclude our discussion by suggesting that based on the solo framework that we have built, countries must raise their capital stock in order to generate high levels of income. And this is necessary for a number of reasons. One, to sustain high income, investment must be high. But this investment must take place with efficient technology. So we have seen the predictions of the solo model in the sense that countries will have to sustain high income levels in order to generate high growth rates, and therefore in order to sustain high investment level. But further, this investment must be done with efficient technologies.